When the sun disappeared in the Middle Ages, it didn't just end the workday, it ended the illusion of control. Nightfall wasn't a mood shift or a cozy transition, it was a structural failure of the world. Everything people relied on to move safely, recognize danger and maintain order was tied directly to daylight. When that light went out, the rules didn't change, they simply stopped working. Before we let night fall on the medieval world, take a second to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether it's daylight here or true darkness outside your window right now. Now let's begin. In a medieval world, vision was survival. Roads, paths, doorways, ditches and animals were all navigated by sight alone. There were no reflective surfaces, no glowing signs, no background light bleeding in from anywhere. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the land didn't dim, it vanished. Familiar places became unrecognizable. Distances collapsed. What was 10 steps away in daylight might as well have been another country at night. This meant that danger didn't need to appear to be lethal. It could already be there, waiting quietly, unseen. A misstep into a ditch could break a leg. A stumble into a fence or cart could knock you unconscious. A fall into water could end your life without witnesses. Darkness didn't need villains. It was fully capable of killing you on its own. The medieval night was not a pause. It was a withdrawal of infrastructure. Paths ceased to function. Boundaries disappeared. Even your own body became less reliable. Your feet searched for ground that might not be there. Your hands reached for walls that had moved just enough to miss. Your confidence evaporated faster than the daylight. And fear followed immediately behind it. People knew this. They planned around it. Entire daily routines were built on the assumption that once the sun was gone, you stayed where you were, or you accepted the risk. Travel slowed, then stopped. Work ended not because people were tired, but because the environment had become actively hostile. Night wasn't neutral, it was a hazard. The lack of light also meant the loss of social visibility. During the day, your presence could be seen, identified, explained. At night, you became a silhouette, or worse, a sound, and sounds carried poorly. Footsteps echoed. A cough sounded closer than it was. A rustle could belong to anything. Darkness didn't clarify, it multiplied possibilities. This is where fear became practical. Medieval people didn't fear the night because they were ignorant or superstitious. They feared it because the night removed feedback. You could no longer tell what was happening around you. You couldn't assess risk. You couldn't react quickly. And you couldn't summon help without first being located, which required light. Even communities felt this shift. A village that functioned as a network of people during the day became a collection of isolated spaces at night. Homes turned inward, doors closed, voices lowered. The sense of shared safety dissolved with the sunlight. The world didn't feel smaller at night. It felt hollowed out. And this absence bred imagination, but not the whimsical kind. Your mind filled gaps aggressively, defensively. Every unknown sound leaned toward danger. Every movement felt intentional. In the dark, uncertainty didn't stay neutral. It tilted toward threat. Your brain wasn't trying to scare you. It was trying to keep you alive with incomplete information. This was the first and most fundamental terror of medieval night. Not monsters, not crime, not superstition, but exposure. Darkness stripped people of their most basic defense, awareness. Without it, even familiar spaces became hostile terrain. The good news, you survived the day. The bad news, the planet just turned the lights off. When we talk about medieval darkness, it's easy to imagine something poetic, soft shadows, candle-lit windows, maybe a gentle moon making the world look mysterious and cinematic. Unfortunately, reality was far less artistic. Medieval darkness wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a hostile environmental condition. It didn't dim the world, it devoured it. To understand this, you have to forget everything your eyes are used to. Today, even rural areas glow faintly with distant towns, headlights, and sky glow. A cloudless night still reflects city light. A cloudy night reflects even more. Even when it's dark, it's not dark, it's modern dark. The Middle Ages had no such mercy. Once the sun slipped away, the medieval landscape became something close to sensory erasure. Sight didn't just weaken, it retired for the evening. Even a moonlit night wasn't reliable. Clouds blocked it, trees overshadowed it, and moonlight, romantic as it may seem, barely illuminated anything beyond a few pale shapes. You might see the outline of a building, but the moment you moved, it vanished again behind the night like a guilty secret. Imagine standing outside your house at night and not being able to see the house, not the door, not the roof, and not even the vague silhouette of where it should be. The structure you live in, your largest, most familiar landmark, could simply slip into the dark, and you would have to trust your memory of where you left it. Distances became guesses, directions became opinions, landmarks failed their job descriptions entirely. A well-known path in daylight became a corridor of uncertainty at night. Something as simple as turning around could erase your sense of orientation completely. One wrong step, one unexpected curve in the road, and suddenly you were walking into a different part of the village, believing you were heading home. Medieval people didn't get lost, they got displaced by darkness, and the darkness was interactive. Moving through it changed it. Windows stayed shuttered, hearth fires were banked low to avoid wasting fuel. Candles weren't used freely because they were expensive and short-lived. Imagine a world where every indoor light source came with guilt, budgeting, and a guaranteed expiration time. You didn't just use light, you rationed it. This meant most homes emitted almost no glow into the streets. There were no windows spilling warm candlelight onto the ground. At best, you got a faint glimmer through a crack in the shutters, just enough to remind you that someone was inside, but not enough to guide you anywhere. A medieval village at night looked more like a collection of invisible houses than a community. Even people inside their homes were often sitting in darkness. They didn't waste a candle just to see. You didn't light a room because it was gloomy. You lit it because you had a task, and when that task ended, so did the flame. Families sat in the dark. They spoke in the dark. They went to bed in the dark. Darkness wasn't an intruder. It was a roommate. Outside, it was even worse. Most roads didn't have clear borders. No fences, no railings, no reflective surfaces, not even guaranteed flatness. A path might suddenly drop into a ditch, or merge into another road without warning. Night erased edges. Your feet discovered the truth before your eyes did, and often it wasn't pleasant. Trees disappeared into the void unless silhouetted against something bright, which, at night, was nothing. Rivers vanished too. You could hear water but not know how close you were to it. Fields and forest borders blended together. A village boundary you could point to confidently during the day dissolved into guesswork. Walking outdoors without a torch or lantern was basically an intelligence test, and the test was graded harshly. Why not just carry a torch, or you might ask? Because torches burned fast, smoked heavily, and were impossible to manage casually. Some required constant readjusting because pieces of burning material fell off the end. Yes, fell off. Fire, the only thing keeping you alive in the darkness, frequently tried to catch you on fire instead. A bad trade. So most people simply stayed indoors because anything else meant voluntarily entering a world without outlines, without boundaries, and without navigational cues. A world where your own home could betray you by disappearing into the night if you took 3 steps too far to the left. Medieval darkness wasn't atmospheric. It wasn't moody. It didn't make the world look beautiful or mysterious. It made the world look gone. And if you were unlucky enough to walk into it, well, this wasn't you might trip. This was you might lose the village. This wasn't moody darkness. It was lose your house darkness. If medieval darkness was a beast, then fire was the one flimsy whip people carried around, hoping it would behave. It was the only artificial light most households had, but light might be too generous a word. Fire flickered, sputtered, smoked, burned unvenly, cost money, demanded supervision, and had the distinct habit of trying to kill you if you looked away for more than 10 seconds. Think of it as a toddler made of flames, vital to the household, but guaranteed to cause trouble the moment you relaxed. Let's start with the most basic tool of nighttime survival, the candle. Medieval candles were not the smooth, clean-burning, vanilla-scented pillars of modern living rooms. They were short, smoky, lumpy, and often made of tallow, rendered animal fat which produced a scent best described as hot barnyard. Lighting one did not create ambience, it created obligation. You had to constantly manage the flames, trim the wick, adjust its angle, and pray it didn't gutter itself into darkness at the slightest draught. And drafts were everywhere. Medieval houses were not sealed boxes, they were sieve-like structures committed to the belief that air circulation should behave like a naughty ghost. A breeze slipped through a wall crack, a door hinge shuddered, someone sneezed too hard, and suddenly your one reliable light source threw a tantrum and died. If candles were temperamental, rushlights were downright unstable. Rushlights were thin plants, rushes, soaked in animal fat and lit like greasy miniature torches. They burned fast, dimly and unevenly, like the budget option for people who needed light but resented the concept. A single rushlight might last 15 minutes on a good day, which meant if you were reading, writing, sewing, or simply not wanting to stub your toe into the next century, you had to keep a pile of them ready and rotate them constantly. Picture this. It's late, the room is silent, and your only light is a piece of plant soaked in fat that is determined to collapse in on itself. You're trying to complete a simple task, say threading a needle or checking a ledger, and you're racing against the clock because your light source is not on your side. It's not helping you. It's sabotaging you slowly, one guttering flicker at a time. Then there was the hearth fire, the medieval equivalent of central lighting, except that it only illuminated the area directly in front of it, and everything behind you remained fully on the side of darkness. The hearth was essential for heat and cooking, but as a light source it was unreliable. The wood might crackle too loudly, obscuring sounds you needed to hear. Sparks could fly without warning. Smoke might billow if the flue misbehaved, and if the fire burned too low, it stopped illuminating anything except your growing frustration. Keeping a hearth fire alive throughout the night was a task in itself. It required banking, pushing embers together, covering them with ash, and coaxing them into lasting until morning. But if you banked them too little, the fire died. Too much, and the house filled with smoke. Medieval households were basically running nightly experiments on how to keep a controlled flame alive without setting the building on fire or suffocating in the process. And speaking of setting things on fire, open flames indoors were an ongoing threat. Curtains, straw mattresses, hanging clothes, loose hair, children, livestock, and even the occasional passing adult could be ignited if they drifted too close. Fire didn't care, fire wasn't loyal. Fire would happily light your way one moment and then consume your home the next. The level of supervision required to keep a flame alive made artificial light less like a convenience and more like a babysitting job. Someone always had to be nearby, someone always had to check the wick, adjust the oil, poke the coals, or replace the rush. Let your attention drift, and darkness would reclaim the room without apology. All this made nighttime activities complicated. Want to write? Better hope your quill behaves while your candle slowly dissolves into a puddle of greasy despair. Want to mend clothes? Enjoy trying to guide a needle under the glow of a trembling flame that can barely illuminate the table. Want to walk across the room? Prepare either to trip or to carry a flame so fragile that your own footsteps might kill it. Even wealth didn't solve the problem. Richer households used beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter, but even those were expensive luxuries to be used sparingly. A nobleman might afford to light his hall with several candles, but the servants' quarters still relied on the fat-on-a-stick system. And no matter how wealthy you were, you still lived in a world where fire was both the solution and the threat. The medieval night was not merely dark, it was a negotiation between humans and flame. You needed fire desperately, but fire demanded payment in the form of attention, caution, and sometimes your eyebrows. Light existed. It just required constant supervision and mild fear. In the Middle Ages, shadows weren't gentle companions or artistic accents. They were active participants in your nightly anxiety. They behaved less like visual phenomena and more like uninvited guests, slipping across walls, stretching into corners, and moving exactly when you hoped they would stay still. Firelight created shadows, yes, but it also animated them, giving every dark shape in your home a private life of its own. The fundamental problem was this: firelight is unstable. It isn't constant. It doesn't beam evenly across a room like modern bulbs. It pulses, it flutters, it brightens, it sags, it sways in the slightest draught like it's performing a nervous dance. And every time it moves, the shadows it casts shift with it, growing longer, shrinking suddenly, or bending at angles that defy logic. Imagine sitting at a wooden table trying to concentrate on something simple, mending clothes, carving wood, or sharing a quiet conversation, while the only light source throws silhouettes around the room like a mischievous child with no concept of appropriate timing. One moment, the corner looks empty. The next, it looks occupied. Nothing has changed except the flame, but that was enough to make the corners feel like they were holding their breath. And because medieval houses were built of uneven materials, warped beams, rough plaster, crooked stones, the shadows rarely behaved predictably. There were no smooth walls or flat surfaces to stabilize their shapes. The light hit bumps and ridges, making silhouettes shiver, ripple, and distort. A pile of tools could suddenly resemble a crouched figure. A hanging cloak might appear to tilt its head. Even a chair leg could stretch across the floor like something reaching. This wasn't paranoia. This was optical reality. Worse still, medieval people weren't surrounded by safe assumptions. Today, if you see a shifting shadow, your brain calmly files it under light from the TV, passing car headlights, or ceiling fan. In the Middle Ages, there were no such explanations. People lived with a worldview that included spirits, demons, omens, curses, invisible forces, and nighttime danger as everyday possibilities. When a shadow moved unexpectedly, your brain didn't say, "Oh, that's odd." It said, "Maybe something is here." And something had a long list of candidates. Even in ears, the imagination didn't need permission to panic. A loose shutter created a draft that made the shadows sway. A log shifted in the hearth, throwing light upward, and suddenly every object in the room grew taller or more distorted. A gust down the chimney caused the flame to jump and twist, and instantly your cozy room became the stage for silhouettes you didn't recognize. In a world that treated the night as a boundary between the normal and the supernatural, shadows were not harmless. They were suspicious. Medieval people watched them carefully because movement in the dark didn't have to be human to be dangerous, and yet the shadows weren't content with staying indoors. Step outside with a candle or torch and the situation worsened. The flame flickered wildly in the wind, causing your own shadow to lurch around like a drunk giant. Trees cast jagged shapes that swayed even when the branches were still. Animals scurried at the edge of visibility, their shadows stretching disproportionately across the ground. A cat slinking past could look like a wolf. A branch falling in the wind could appear like a figure stepping forward. Even your own movements multiplied. One shadow became two, then three, overlapping and shifting as the flame sputtered. Your shadow could look like it was following you, or worse, like something was walking beside you. And then there were the moments when the light dipped for a second, just a second. Shadow surged forward as if reaching for you, then snapped back when the flame steadied itself. Nothing physical had changed, but your heart didn't know that. Your brain saw movement. It responded accordingly. Inside the mind, the fear lived quietly at first, then louder. A moving shadow wasn't simply unsettling, it suggested the presence of something unknown. Something watching, something waiting for the flame to falter. Firelight created just enough illumination to see danger without identifying it. A perfect recipe for fear that snowballed every time the flame shuddered. Even communal spaces weren't immune. In large halls or inns, multiple candles threw tangled shadow everywhere. People sitting at long tables appeared stretched or doubled. Shapes danced across rafters. The more light sources you added, the more complicated and unpredictable the shadows became. Night gatherings required you to pretend that a shadow suddenly rushing across the wall was nothing, even though your instincts had already thrown themselves out a window. Medieval night wasn't defined only by darkness, it was defined by movement within the darkness. Firelight didn't simply reveal things, it transformed them. It turned the familiar into the uncanny, reminded you how fragile your sense of sight was, and collaborated eagerly with your fears. Firelight didn't calm you, it recruited your imagination. Once the sun disappeared, medieval society didn't just slow down, it loosened its grip. Order had business hours, and those hours ended sharply at a sunset. Night belonged to whoever was willing to take risks, move in silence, and exploit the fact that everyone else was either asleep, terrified, or both. In the Middle Ages, where people feared the dark not only because they couldn't see, but because someone else might be very good at seeing them. To understand this properly, you have to picture a world where security was a suggestion, not a system. Locks were primitive, walls were thin, and windows, where they existed at all, were little more than holes covered with shutters, cloth, or thin wooden lattices. A determined burglar didn't need finesse. They needed time, darkness, and the confidence of a person who knew the night was on their side. Criminals in the Middle Ages weren't necessarily sophisticated. Many were simply opportunists who recognized that darkness gave them one enormous advantage: invisibility. No street lamps, no watch lights, no distant glow from another village. If you blended into the night, you were effectively erased. Victims couldn't identify you. Witnesses couldn't describe you. And targets couldn't see you coming until you were already taking something they owned. Thieves, both amateurs and professionals, knew that nighttime was the closest thing to a loophole that medieval life offered. During the day, a village functioned as a collection of eyes. People saw who passed through, who carried what, who was loitering too long near a door. At night, that vigilance shut off like a snuffed candle. You could walk past a dozen houses without a single person knowing you'd been there. You could break in, slip out, and be gone before anyone registered the noise. And noise was the only clue. Crime in the nighttime world was a sound-based event. The creak of a door hinge, the thud of a misplaced footstep, the sudden silence of animals that sensed a presence. People lay awake listening for things that didn't belong because sound was the only warning system anyone had. But listening didn't guarantee safety. Hearing something was not the same as stopping it. If you suspected a thief was outside, you had exactly two options. Wake your household and hope the noise scared the intruder away. Do nothing and pray the thief was just passing by, which was medieval optimism at its purest. Going outside to confront a criminal? That was a level of bravery most people reserved for folk tales. You didn't know how many people were out there, or whether they were armed, or whether they were desperate. You couldn't even judge how far away they were based on sound alone. An intruder could be 20 feet away or pressed directly against the wall. The night kept those details to itself. And crime wasn't limited to simple burglary. Assaults, ambushes, and sudden acts of violence were significantly more common after sunset. Travelling after dark was basically an invitation for someone to relieve you of your belongings, your dignity, or your life. Roads were uncontrolled, villages had no night patrols beyond occasional sleepy watchmen, and the law refused responsibility until daylight returned, because that's when you could actually see wrongdoing. Thieves took advantage of this lack of accountability. A stolen chicken, a missing purse, a vanished tool. These were crimes that often went unreported simply because they were unsolvable. No one knew who did it. No one saw anything. And chasing someone into pitch-black darkness was the good way to turn the crime into a 2-for-1 loss. Worse still, some thieves weren't strangers. They could be neighbours, local drifters, young men who knew exactly which houses had loose shutters or which families were asleep early. Familiarity made them efficient. They knew the pathways between homes, they knew the hiding spots, they knew who kept their valuables in bags versus boxes, who stored tools outdoors, and who wouldn't dare investigate a noise. In larger medieval towns, night crime formed its own ecosystem. Gangs operated beneath bridges, in abandoned alleys or behind taverns whose doors had closed hours earlier. They specialised in ambushing lone travellers or robbing drunk patrons who staggered home without a torch. In cities with walls, gates closed at sunset, but crime didn't stop, it simply concentrated inside the walls with the rest of the population. Then there was the problem of accountability. Even if you caught a thief, justice depended heavily on daylight. People needed to see the accused clearly. Witness testimony relied on recognition. And if nobody recognised the thief, well, night had once again protected its favourites. The truth was simple. Medieval law was strongest when the sun was up. It relied on visibility, crowds, open spaces, and shared responsibility. Once darkness rolled in, all those structures collapsed. Fear filled the gaps, crime followed fear, and opportunists followed both. Daytime had laws, nighttime had opportunities. In the Middle Ages, nothing announced the arrival of night more clearly, or more ominously than the curfew bell. It wasn't like modern curfews, which might come from a law, a town rule, or a stressed parent texting "be home now." Medieval curfews were the sound of authority reminding you that the world was about to become dangerous, chaotic, and extremely judgmental. Once that bell rang, you were expected to be indoors, accounted for, and preferably pretending to sleep. Whatever you needed to do should have been done before the bell. After it, the night belonged to suspicion. The word curfew itself comes from couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. The original idea was simple. As darkness crept in, households should dampen their hearths so they wouldn't burn out of control while everyone slept. But this practical fire safety routine quickly expanded into something far more sweeping. The bell became not just a call to smother flames, but a signal to smother movement altogether. Once the curfew bell sounded, the town didn't just quiet down, it shut down. Doors closed, shutters clapped. The last stragglers hurried home like they'd forgotten the stove was on. Anyone outside after that point was no longer an innocent civilian. They were now a person of interest, whether the interest was suspicion, fear, or a general belief that someone who ignored the curfew had no good reason to avoid the safety of walls and family. Why the hostility toward nighttime wandering? Because it went directly against social expectations. Medieval communities valued predictability. They were built on the assumption that people belonged in certain places at certain times. Daylight was for labour, errands, trade and travel. Nighttime was for nothing respectable anyway. So if you were outdoors after the bell, you were assumed to be participating in one of the following medieval hobbies: sneaking around where you didn't belong, meeting someone you shouldn't be meeting, stealing something you couldn't afford, conducting a crime you definitely planned too well. Being possessed, a popular theory surprisingly often applied. The default assumption was simple: good people slept. Suspicious people didn't. And because defending yourself in court with "I couldn't sleep" or "I was taking a walk" wasn't a concept yet, anyone caught wandering after hours had to explain themselves to the authorities, usually in a very dark street, surrounded by very sceptical men whose torches made everything look guilty. Night watchmen, though often tired and not exactly elite enforcers, were trained in one thing: treating nighttime movement as a red flag. Their job wasn't to patrol politely, it was to stop people, question them, and in many regions, immediately detain them if their answers sounded even slightly creative. The assumption wasn't innocent until proven guilty. It was, "Why are you outside?" and the burden of proof was now entirely on you. Plenty of towns had explicit rules about this. In some places, it was illegal to leave your home after curfew, unless you were a doctor, midwife, or person carrying a lit lantern, and loudly announcing your presence like a medieval version of "I am not the problem here." Even then, the watchman might stop you just to make sure your lantern wasn't a disguise for suspicious intent. People followed the rules because the consequences of breaking them weren't trivial. If someone shouted "Stop thief" at night, the community didn't wait for explanations, they reacted. Being outdoors at the wrong time could get you tackled, dragged into a guard post, fined, or added to a list of people the community now watched closely during the day. You didn't want to be on that list. Medieval gossip travelled faster than disease, and both had consequences. And then there was the psychological side. When everyone expects danger at night, anyone walking around becomes the danger by default. Even if your intentions were honest, people's fears would turn you into a threat in their imaginations long before you ever reached their door. For example, let's say your cow escaped at night and you went out to find it. The moment someone saw you wandering with a rope in your hand, they didn't think, "Ah, a concerned femmer." They thought, "He's looking for something to steal." If you were unlucky, the watch might even escort you home for your own protection, which was medieval for, "We don't trust you either." Curfew culture wasn't about limiting freedom. It was about preserving order in a world where nighttime was the closest thing to a legal blind spot. People relied on the curfew to know when danger began, because it definitely did begin. Crime rose after sunset, movement increased unpredictably, and the inability to see clearly turned every unknown figure into a potential threat. The curfew bell wasn't a suggestion. It was society's way of saying, if you're still outside, we assume you're up to something criminal or worse. If you picture medieval night watchmen as brave guardians patrolling the streets with fierce discipline and unwavering alertness, you may want to lower your expectations. The average night watchman was less heroic sentinel of justice and more exhausted man trying not to nap standing up. They were the last line of defence between the village and whatever lurked in the dark, but only because everyone else had gone to bed and someone had to do it. The idea behind the night watch was simple. Since nighttime was dangerous, someone should stay awake. The execution of this idea was less impressive. Many watchmen weren't professionals. They were regular townspeople rotated into shifts they didn't want, didn't ask for, and weren't particularly good at. Some towns required each household to supply a watchman on a rotating schedule. Others required able-bodied men to take their turn patrolling, no matter how little experience they had in noticing danger or dealing with it. Imagine finishing a long day of labour, farming, hauling, smithing, brewing, weaving, and then hearing, "Congratulations, it's your turn to stay awake all night and guard the town. Try not to fall asleep or die." It was not a glamorous assignment. It wasn't even an appreciated one. Everyone wanted the watch to exist, but nobody wanted to be the watch. So who ended up doing it? The tired, the unfortunate, the unlucky, the "it's your turn, stop complaining." Many watchmen patrolled the streets only because the alternative was getting fined, punished, or shamed by the community. And shame was a powerful motivator, especially when your neighbours were watching during the day and judging at full brightness. Training, if it existed at all, was minimal. A new watchman might be told which streets to walk, where to stand, when to ring the bell for trouble, and which drunks to ignore because he's harmless unless you wake him up too quickly. Beyond that, their qualifications were assumed to be instinct and enthusiasm, neither of which are reliable at 2 a.m. Their equipment didn't help matters. A typical night watchman carried a lantern or torch that flickered more than it illuminated, a staff, club, or some kind of stick that looked threatening if you squinted, occasionally a horn or the bell, to signal danger and a level of alertness best described as hopeful. Their clothing wasn't uniform or intimidating. It was whatever they already owned. A watchman might be patrolling the street wearing his work clothes, a cloak, and the unmistakable expression of a man questioning his life choices. Because they were so tired, and because the human body is not designed to stay alert after a day of physical labour, watchmen were famous for falling asleep. Entire laws existed forbidding sleeping on duty, which is proof that sleeping on duty was very much happening. Town officials punished dozing watchmen harshly, not because it truly solved the problem, but because it looked like they were trying. Some watchmen developed coping techniques. They sang softly to themselves. They tapped their staffs on the cobblestones. They walked in short loops to stay awake. Others leaned on walls just for a second, and immediately regretted it when they woke up at dawn and realised they had failed both their town and their shift. And then there were the watchmen who didn't fall asleep, but probably wished they had. Nighttime brought noises that demanded investigation. A creak, a thud, a distant shout, an animal call that might be a wolf or might be a man pretending to be a wolf. The watchman had to check each one, armed with nothing but a torch that threatened to go out whenever a breeze passed by. Every sound required courage, every shadow raised questions, every unexpected movement forced the watchman to make decisions he was neither trained nor prepared for. Imagine approaching a dark alley because you heard something move, knowing you're the only one awake to handle whatever is there. And if you're imagining this scene with confidence or swagger, stop. Replace swagger with dread and confidence with bargaining. Yet for all their flaws, the watchmen played a vital role. Their presence, however drowsy, served as a deterrent. Criminals preferred stealth, and even a half-awake guard carrying a lantern was enough to make them reconsider their schedule. Watchmen shouted warnings, alerted neighbours, and when fully awake, could gather assistance quickly. They weren't perfect, but they were present, and presence mattered. Still, no one pretended they were elite defenders. Communities accepted that their nighttime security was provided by honest men doing their best under poor circumstances, with poor supplies and even poorer sleep schedules. Protection existed. It was simply provided by the men fighting sleep more than crime. When medieval people lay awake at night, they weren't just listening for thieves or worrying about the shadows inside their homes. They were also listening for the world outside, which sounded like a collection of living nightmares rehearsing for a midnight performance. Nocturnal animals were everywhere, and they had absolutely no interest in keeping quiet. To a medieval listener, every rustle, growl, yelp, and screech carried weight, because the night belonged to creatures far better equipped to navigate it than humans. The most infamous of these creatures were wolves. Medieval Europe had no shortage of them, and their presence was a constant reminder that humans did not sit at the top of the food chain as securely as they liked to believe. By day, wolves tended to keep their distance. By night, they became bold. Their howls carried across fields and into villages, echoing in a way that made it impossible to judge their distance. A wolf could be miles away, or at the hedgerow by your house. The acoustics of fear were not helpful. Wolves didn't need to attack humans regularly to inspire terror. The threat alone did the job. People knew wolves took livestock, scavenged near settlements, and moved silently through the forests. A nighttime howl wasn't just a sound, it was a warning that something dangerous was awake, mobile, and better adapted to the dark than any human standing behind a shutter. But for many medieval people, the more nerve-wracking noises came from animals far less dramatic than wolves. Dogs, for instance, barked at everything: strangers, wildlife, the wind, nothing at all, or possibly something supernatural. It was hard to tell. And the dogs weren't offering explanations. A barking dog jolted entire households awake because barking meant something had entered the dog's perimeter. Whether that something was a fox or a criminal or a curse was for the terrified listener to imagine. And then there were barn animals. Cows shifting in the night could sound disturbingly human. Chickens screamed when startled, which they did approximately whenever they felt like it. Goats made unpredictable noises that ranged from bored grunts to what could only be described as existential wailing. Horses stamped their hooves or sorted loudly in barns, sounding like large intruders if you didn't know better. But the real champions of nighttime shock value were the smaller creatures: foxes, owls, badgers, and creatures that made noises modern people rarely hear outside horror films. Foxes in particular produced screeches that sounded like a person in distress. Owls hooted, shrieked, or hissed depending on their mood. Even hedgehogs made unsettling snuffling sounds as they rummaged through gardens, which to a half-asleep villager might easily be mistaken for something dangerous. And then there were the noises no one could identify. The Middle Ages didn't come with field guides or "what animal's making that sound" websites. A mysterious cry in the distance remained mysterious. People created explanations where knowledge failed. Ghosts, spirits, shapeshifters, forest demons, witches travelling under cover of night. Fear didn't just thrive in darkness, it took on the shapes carved by sound. Medieval homes were not soundproof. Walls were thin, roofs creaked, windows had no glass to mute noise. The night outside flowed into the house just as easily as cold air did. A growl in the distance might vibrate through a wooden wall. A rustle outside the door sounded magnified. Even a simple breeze could create noises that mimicked footsteps or heavy breathing. In a world thick with belief in supernatural creatures, these sounds weren't dismissed. They were interpreted. And interpretation leaned toward terror. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, staring into darkness, listening to an animal cry outside. You don't know what it is. You don't know where it is. You don't know whether it's hunting, hurt, angry, lost, or simply loud. What you do know is that it's awake, mobile, and unbothered by the very darkness that is currently making you useless. Somehow silence wasn't better. When the animals went quiet, that meant something had startled them. Silence in the medieval night was often louder than sound because it signalled a shift, something moving through the area, something the animals sensed but you could not. And because the medieval imagination lived on a steady diet of folklore, every unexplained noise had a potential supernatural origin. A cracking branch might be a wandering spirit. A distant wail might belong to a mythic creature. The line between natural and supernatural blurred after sunset because there was no way to confirm either. In the dark, everything had equal potential to be real. Animals didn't mean to terrify humans. They were simply doing what they always did, hunting, calling, warning, and communicating with each other. But for the people lying awake in their homes, the night felt like a conversation happening outside that they were never meant to overhear and could never fully understand. Some noises were wolves, the rest were emotionally worse. When people imagine the medieval night, they often picture scents, a peaceful, moonlit world where the only sound is the soft whisper of wind and maybe a poetic owl hooting in the distance. That version belongs in movies and postcards. The real medieval night was noisy, not city noisy, not highway noisy, but the kind of noisy where every sound was a question, and every question had a potentially alarming answer. Medieval buildings were not built with acoustics in mind. Houses were made of wood, wattle, and daub, thatch or stone, all of which had one thing in common. They moved. Wood expanded and contracted, thatch rustled, beam shifted. Floors creaked under temperature changes. Walls settled in ways that produced pops and groans, like the house was trying to speak up about its discomforts. During the day, these sounds disappeared into the chaos of life, hammering, talking, animals, market noise. But at night, when darkness crushed visibility and fear sharpened hearing, every tiny sound became a headline. A groaning beam wasn't the wood cooling, it was something shifting. A thump in the roof wasn't a bird landing, it was something above you. Wind also played its part. Medieval homes weren't sealed, so wind slithered through gaps in shutters, between door frames and beneath walls. It made things rattle, it made things knock. It made that one loose roof tile clatter in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously intentional. And when the wind picked up and blew across chimneys, it produced low, hollow tones that sounded like the house was breathing poorly. Even outside, the wind brought more than just air. It carried sounds from afar, stretching and warping them. A distant dog's bark could sound like it was right outside. The low murmur of a river could mimic whispers. Trees rustling in the forest could sound like footsteps approaching, and footsteps approaching could sound like trees rustling. The medieval sound ecosystem had no respect for clarity. Creaking wood, normal. Movement on the roof, also normal. Something scraping against stone, normal but terrifying anyway. Then there were animals, but not the dramatic predators from the previous chapter. We're talking about pests and scavengers, rats, mice, ferrets, stray cats, stoats, and creatures that loved crawling through walls, rafters, and thatch roofs. They produced constant, unpredictable noise, scratching, scurrying, tiny footsteps in the ceiling, occasional thumps, a sudden rattle, the kind of sounds modern people associate with haunted houses, not everyday life. Rats in particular were acoustic overachievers. They gnawed, squeaked, rummaged, knocked over small objects, and held what sounded like midnight conferences inside walls. To a medieval listener, these weren't household pests. They were things moving in the dark where I cannot see them. And because people's mental catalogues of night sounds weren't filled with benign explanations, every noise carried the potential for danger. But the most unsettling category of nightly noise was the unidentified one. Something moved outside, something brushed the wall, something bumped into a fence, something rustled behind a storage barrel, something knocked once, then stayed quiet. These weren't sounds with clear sources, they were sounds that demanded interpretation. And interpretation at night was a dangerous game. Was that the wind? An animal? A person? Something worse? Or just your imagination? The medieval mind rarely picked the least frightening option. Inside homes, even human movement contributed to the noise. Someone rolled over in bed and wood creaked loudly. Someone whispered and it echoed strangely. Babies cried at unpredictable intervals. Older relatives snored like wounded beasts. Every household sound was magnified by the quiet outside and the fear inside. Silence, true silence, was nearly impossible. And when it did arrive, it was almost worse than noise. Because silence meant something had changed. Animals stop making noise when they sense a predator. Wind stills before storms. Villages go quiet when someone is listening. To a medieval sleeper, silence wasn't peaceful. It was suspicious. Because the night was, above all else, a time of uncertainty. You couldn't see anything, so you listened for everything. Your ears became your only source of information, and the noises they fed you rarely offered comfort. A creak in the rafters wasn't reassuring. A thud outside wasn't expected. A sudden burst of wind wasn't soothing. And a completely silent moment wasn't peaceful. The medieval night was never still. It was alive with sounds, some explainable, some ambiguous, and some that didn't deserve to be investigated in any lighting conditions. Silence was rare. Comfort was non-existent. A modern home is a fortress by medieval standards. Walls are thick, windows seal shut, insulation muffles sound, and doors have locks that actually mean something. A medieval house, on the other hand, was a suggestion, an optimistic attempt at shelter, rather than a true barrier against the outside world. It offered protection from rain, contained your family, kept the worst of the wind out, and provided a place to sleep, but it absolutely did not separate you from the night. The first thing to understand is that most medieval homes were lightweight by design. Wood, wattle iron, daub and thatch were the building blocks of everyday living. These materials were cheap, local and easy to assemble, but they weren't exactly known for strength or silence. A wooden wall might flex in the wind. A thatched roof might dip during storms. A daub wall could crack if you leaned on it too confidently. Homes creaked, shifted, and breathed right along with the weather. More importantly, medieval housing was full of gaps. Gaps between boards, gaps near doors, gaps in the roof, and gaps around windows. You didn't need a keyhole to see outside. You needed eyes and patience. Light leaked out. Air drifted in, and sound passed through, like the house wasn't even trying to stop it. Privacy wasn't something you had, it was something you imagined. At night, these gaps turned the house into an acoustic instrument, amplifying noises from outside and carrying your own noises outward. You could hear the night as if it had stepped inside. Footsteps outside sounded closer than they were. Animal calls seemed amplified. Wind whistled through in strange tones depending on which cracks it found. Even the movement of distant neighbours travelling down the road might echo faintly inside your living space. And because the walls were so thin, the night could hear you too. A cough might alert an animal or a wandering stranger to your presence. The crackling of your hearth could signal a warm home full of sleeping occupants. Even a whispered conversation might drift outside and blend with the darkness, becoming one more ambiguous sound among many. Medieval people were aware of this. Silence at night was a survival strategy, not a courtesy. Windows didn't help much either. Glass was rare and expensive, so most homes relied on shutters, simple wooden panels that closed against the outside. Shutters didn't seal. They clapped in the wind, rattled in storm, and left small spaces where the night peered in like a polite but persistent intruder. If you were lucky, you stuffed straw or cloth around the edges to reduce drafts, but drafts had a way of negotiating their own entrance. Roofing was another vulnerability. Thatch might keep out rain, but it wasn't a barrier to sound or animals. Creatures made their homes in it, birds, rodents, insects, all of which contributed to movement and noise above your head. On windy nights, the entire roof shifted, rustled, and sighed in ways that suggested it had opinions about the weather. This wasn't a structure, it was a participant. Larger homes weren't much better. Stone houses had sturdier walls, yes, but those walls echoed. Sound reverberated inside chambers, hallways, and stairwells. Drafts slipped through cracks in masonry. Heavy wooden doors, though impressive by daylight, still let noise seep under their frames. If anything, stone architecture amplified certain sounds. Footsteps, whispers, distant noises that crawled in through arrow loops or gaps where the mortar had crumbled over time. None of this inspired confidence at night. When you lay in bed, you didn't feel enclosed. You felt partially wrapped, like someone had draped the concept of a house over you, but hadn't finished the job. The night pressed against the walls, moved through them, and responded when your own movements made noise, and then there was the problem of structural vulnerability. Homes could be broken into easily. A shutter could be pried open with a stick. A door wall could be scraped through with a tool and determination. Doors had locks, but many were little more than wooden bars or latches that discouraged polite intruders, but didn't stop committed ones. If someone wanted to get into your home wasn't going to put up much of a fight. Even the layout of medieval homes worked against nighttime security. Many had only one room or two small chambers. Sleep happened near the entrance because that's where the warmth was. That also meant you were close to the door if someone decided to test it. Distance was not on your side. The threshold between inside and outside was thin, physically, acoustically, and psychologically. Your house did not separate you from the darkness. It hosted the darkness at its edges and invited it to listen in. In the modern world, home is a sanctuary. In the medieval world, home was a shelter with hobbies. It shifted, it creaked, it leaked, it listened. And most of all, your home could hear the night, and the night could hear you. In the Middle Ages, sleeping alone wasn't a symbol of independence. It was a questionable life choice. Medieval people weren't shy about sharing space because nighttime wasn't simply a time to rest. It was when every fear sharpened, every creak mattered, and every unknown sound might be announcing trouble. Sleeping with other people wasn't inconvenient or awkward. It was security. It was warmth. And frankly, it was common sense. Families, large, small, wealthy or poor, almost always slept together. Not just in the same room, but often in the same bed. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes extended relatives shared sleeping spaces because safety came in numbers. A full room didn't just mean company. It meant fewer blind spots, more ears to hear trouble, more bodies to respond if something went wrong. One person could sleep through a noise, 5 people couldn't. And noise wasn't the only concern. Fire was unpredictable. Animals wandered indoors. Drafts found every weakness in the walls. A sleeping space wasn't just for resting. It was a defensive station. The more people gathered there, the more likely someone would notice if the embers flared too high, the wind blew the shutters open, or something moved where it shouldn't. Communal sleeping also reflected medieval practicality. Houses were small. Heating them was expensive. A family gathering around a single hearth for warmth during the day naturally extended to gathering around that same warmth at night. Multiple fires were a luxury most couldn't afford, and the fewer flames burning after dark, the lower the chance your home turned into an uncontrolled bonfire. So families compressed themselves into whatever space was warmest. Personal comfort was less important than waking up alive. Even wealthier households had communal arrangements. Servants slept close to one another in lofts or small chambers. Travellers shared beds in inns with complete strangers. Noble children often slept in nurseries with siblings, attendants, or nursemaids. Privacy was not the goal, vigilance was. And because rooms were shared, beds were shared too. Medieval beds could be large, but even large in medieval terms meant adequate as long as no one moved too much. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, comfortable only in comparison to the floor. People arranged themselves carefully, because if someone rolled too much, everyone knew it. You didn't just feel another person's presence. You negotiated with it all night long. For many, bed sharing also offered emotional reassurance. Darkness was overwhelming. Houses creaked, wind whispered, animals made their unsettling noises. Being alone in that environment meant your imagination had free rein. Being beside someone else, even if they kicked or snored or took too much blanket, gave you an anchor. Human presence dulled the sharp edges of fear. If something happened, at least you wouldn't face it alone. And medieval people absolutely expected something to happen at night. Illness often struck suddenly after sunset. Fires started without warning. Thieves approached in darkness. Wolves howled in the distance. Even a simple misstep on the uneven floor could break your silence and everyone's sleep. Being alone during such events wasn't just frightening, it could be deadly. Communal sleeping also played a role in the informal security system of households. The first person awake because of a noise could alert the others. If something startled the dog, everyone would hear it. If the baby cried, someone soothed it quickly to avoid attracting outside attention. The group became a collective alarm system. No single person had to bear the responsibility of staying alert. The group shared the burden without discussing it. In crowded living spaces, communal sleeping was also a way to conserve resources. Bedding was expensive, mattresses weren't disposable, wool blankets were precious. People layered themselves with whatever they had, and often whatever someone else had. Warmth came from blankets, yes, but also from shared body heat. The more people in a bed, the warmer it got. Comfort wasn't measured in softness or space. It was measured in the difference between shivering and sleeping. Even social status didn't remove this practical arrangement. Visitors and guests often slept in the same room as their hosts. Households that could afford separate chambers used them sparingly. Heating an entire house at night was too costly and too risky. It made more sense to gather everyone close. And while privacy existed in certain noble settings, it wasn't the rigid, sacred concept it is today. Medieval people accepted the realities of their environment. The dark was dangerous, homes were permeable, and solitude was a luxury that came with significant risk. Sleeping alone wasn't romantic or peaceful. It was impractical, it was unnerving, and it was rarely done voluntarily. Whether you were a farmer in a timber cottage or a servant in a manor loft, the logic remained the same. Privacy was optional. Survival wasn't. In the Middle Ages, dreams weren't the random brain static we recognise today. They weren't dismissed as the side effects of stress, digestion, or questionable cheese. They were considered serious business, personal prophecy delivered to your bed like supernatural mail. A dream could reveal danger, expose sin, predict disaster, or remind you that even while sleeping, the universe still had opinions about your life. Nighttime was already a vulnerable period. The dark pressed against the walls. The world outside stirred with creatures and criminals. Inside, your imagination filled in the gaps left by weak firelight and creaking timbers. With all that fear soaking the night, it's no surprise medieval people believed that dreams were not accidents, but messages with intent. Their worldview supported this fully. The medieval mind didn't separate the physical world from the spiritual one. Life was a layered reality where God, angels, demons, spirits, and cosmic forces all operated continuously. So if something vivid appeared in your dreams, it wasn't your subconscious entertaining itself. It was a delivery from the spiritual realm, and you were expected to pay attention. Nightmares were taken especially seriously. A nightmare about falling wasn't shrugged off as a natural fear of losing balance. It could mean divine displeasure. A dream about being chased wasn't considered a stress response. It might suggest that evil forces were hunting your soul. If you dreamed of animals, storms, blood, or shadows, These weren't symbols your brain invented. They were warnings, omens, or glimpses of threats waiting to unfold. Dream interpretation was practically a community sport. Every village had at least one person, an elder, a midwife, a priest, a neighbour, with just enough confidence to sound credible, who could decode dreams. Was the dream about a river? That could symbolise life changing. Did a bird speak to you? That might be a message from the beyond. Did you see someone who had died? Definitely a portent. Dream dictionaries existed long before dictionaries for actual language. Priests were often consulted because dreams were seen as theological events. God communicated through visions after all, scripture made that clear. If a medieval farmer had a dream about a collapsing tower, he might rush to the church for guidance. Maybe it meant a storm was coming. Maybe someone in the household was ill. Maybe a moral failing needed to be corrected immediately. Dream anxiety didn't wait for the sun, and then there were dreams involving demons or temptation. Medieval Christians believed that nighttime was prime time for spiritual attack. Evil forces were thought to target sleeping people because sleep lowered rational defenses. If you had a dream featuring sin, lust, greed, pride, anything that made a monk raise an eyebrow, you might wake up believing that a demon had whispered to you during the night, trying to drag your soul toward ruin. A lustful dream wasn't embarrassing. It was a red flag requiring confession. Even perfectly normal dreams could become troubling when interpreted through this worldview. Dreaming of walking alone might be a sign of upcoming isolation or misfortune. Dreaming of a feast might foreshadow illness caused by excess. Dreaming of your own house could mean your spiritual foundation needed repairing. No wonder people woke up sweating. Every dream demanded analysis and emotional labour long before breakfast. Children in particular were watched closely after nightmares. Parents believed that frightening dreams might indicate curses, witchcraft, or demonic harassment. If a child woke screaming, it wasn't handled with, "It's just a dream." It was handled with prayer, holy water, or stern reminders about good behaviour, because no parent wanted a demon blaming them for raising an undisciplined child. Even dreams that seemed harmless could trigger action. If someone dreamed of a missing object, the next day might involve searching the entire house. If someone dreamed of an argument, they might revisit old grievances. If someone dreamed of a journey, plans might shift. Medieval life took dreams seriously because dreams were part of the information network that shaped decision-making. Some people even prepared for dreams. They prayed before bed so their dreams would be holy. They avoided certain foods believed to cause disturbing visions. Rich meats, heavy wines, and certain herbs. They believed the wrong meal could open the door to spiritual interference. Sleep wasn't just a break, it was a risk. Dreams also provided emotional explanations for what happened during sleep. If someone groaned, convulsed, or spoke at night, behaviours we now attribute to nightmares or sleep disorders, they didn't blame the brain, they blamed the dream. Sleepwalking. The person was trapped in a vision, sleep-talking. The dream was forcing them to speak. Night terrors, a demon, obviously. And all of this existed in a world with deep uncertainty about life, death, illness, and fate. When your days were unpredictable, your dreams felt like rare clues, messages from forces that knew more than you did. Ignoring them felt reckless. So when a medieval person woke from a nightmare, they didn't roll over and go back to sleep. They sat up, they worried, they prayed, they told their family, they sought interpretation. Their heart didn't calm down because the dream ended. Their fear shifted into the waking world. You didn't have a nightmare, you received a message. In the Middle Ages, people believed that God saw everything, but at night his gaze felt closer, sharper, and far more personal. Daylight was for living, working, bargaining, sweating, and trying not to commit any sins too obvious. But night was when the soul became visible. When the world quieted and the mind wandered, heaven felt like it leaned in. listening for the slightest whisper of wrongdoing. Medieval Christianity shaped daily life, but it shaped nighttime life even more. Darkness carried moral expectations. People believed that sin was easier at night, not because temptation increased, but because privacy did. And privacy, in a worldview where God observed every thought, was already suspicious. Night was the time when you were judged not by your actions, but by your intentions. If you so much as thought something questionable after dark, you could wake up truly convinced you had disappointed the Almighty. The logic was simple. Good deeds happened during the day, when you were surrounded by people who could see them. Bad deeds preferred darkness, which meant anyone awake after hours risked sliding into moral danger simply by existing in the wrong context. If someone was wandering the streets after curfew, it wasn't just suspicious socially, it was spiritually alarming. What business could a good Christian possibly have in the hours when, according to sermons, sinful impulses prowled like wolves? Priests preached often about the unique spiritual vulnerabilities of nighttime. The darkness symbolized the absence of divine light. The quiet invited sinful thoughts. The lack of witnesses meant temptation had fewer barriers. Medieval sermons did not do subtlety. They warned that the night was when the devil walked with extra confidence, and when God watched with extra scrutiny. People took this to heart. Before bed, many prayed specifically for protection from nighttime sin, not just external forces, but their own minds. Someone who woke from a troubling dream didn't write it off as weird brain activity. They feared that God had sent a warning, or worse, a test. Nighttime prayers weren't soft lullabies, they were spiritual armour. Lord, guard my soul while I sleep was as common as good night. Families blessed their children before bed, not only for safety, but for purity. If a child muttered something odd in their sleep, you could expect a priestly consultation by morning. Households also used religious items as defences: crosses above the bed, protective charms sanctioned by the church, blessed herbs hung near doorways, or psalms written and tucked beneath pillows. These weren't decorations. They were spiritual shields against the unseen dangers the night supposedly carried. Even the structure of sleep fed into religious fear. Medieval people often slept in 2 shifts, first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between. The middle-of-the-night interval was considered spiritually charged. Churches encouraged prayer then, teaching that the stillness made it an excellent time to reflect on one's sins. And reflect they did, because lying awake in darkness, hearing the world move and mutter outside could make even the most innocent person reconsider every decision they'd ever made. Nighttime confession wasn't uncommon either. People sometimes woke convinced they needed absolution, not because they'd done anything, but because they might have. Thoughts felt heavier in the night. Doubts grew teeth. A stray memory became a potential moral failing. The darkness magnified guilt the same way it magnified sounds, suddenly enormous, suddenly unavoidable. And illnesses that struck after sunset were sometimes interpreted as divine warnings. A fever beginning at dusk might mean God was displeased. A sudden pain at night could be a sign of judgment. Even nightmares, especially vivid ones, were treated as messages urging repentance. Waking up terrified wasn't just frightening, it was spiritually informative. Communities reinforced these ideas socially. Neighbours judged each other's nighttime habits. Staying up too late could earn you rumours of sinful behaviour. Waking up after everyone else might mark you as morally lax. A person who walked outside at odd hours risked becoming the subject of whispered speculation about vices, secret sins, or divine punishment waiting to unfold. Monastic life amplified this even further. Monks rose multiple times a night to chant prayers, believing that darkness was when spiritual discipline mattered most. Their routines shaped broader cultural assumptions. If holy men treated the night as spiritually dangerous, ordinary people certainly felt they had reasons to be cautious. Even natural phenomena took on religious interpretations. A sudden whistle of wind at midnight, perhaps a divine reminder. A loud knock on a shutter, maybe a moral test. Thunder in the darkness could be a sign from above. This wasn't superstition separate from religion. This was religion as medieval people understood it. The darkness wasn't just empty space. It was spiritual theatre where the invisible world became more visible in the imagination. Day was practical, night was moral. Day judged your labour, night judged your soul. Medieval people went to bed knowing that they weren't just alone in the dark, they were being evaluated in it. Day was for work, night was for moral evaluation. In the medieval world, nighttime wasn't just dark, it was spiritually crowded. When the sun went down and shutters were latched, humans withdrew indoors, but according to centuries of belief, something else clocked in. Demons, spirits, restless dead, wandering souls, malicious creatures, and everything the church warned you about during Sunday sermons were thought to roam freely once daylight surrendered. Night was their shift. Humans were merely trying to survive it. To the medieval mind, the darkness wasn't empty. It was occupied. And those occupants were rarely friendly. Christian teachings played a major role in shaping this worldview. Priests preached that demons lurked in the shadows, waiting for moments of weakness. The devil didn't work in subtle metaphors. He worked in darkness, fear, and nighttime temptation. Medieval texts were full of accounts of men and women who felt clawed at, whispered to, or tormented by unseen forces after sunset. Whether these experiences were dreams, sleep paralysis, or imagination didn't matter. What mattered was that they reinforced what everyone already believed. Demons didn't just prefer the dark, they thrived in it. People believed the dark made boundaries thin, allowing spirits easier access to the human world. The line between the living and the dead blurred. Ghosts were said to wander near graveyards, crossroads, or lonely fields, calling out to travellers or knocking on doors. Spirits of the restless dead, those who were murdered, buried improperly, or died unfinished, were believed to rise and roam at night. No one wanted to be outside when that happened, and if you heard footsteps behind you, you prayed they belonged to a drunk neighbour, because the alternatives were supernatural and far worse. Medieval folklore, fed by oral tradition long before the church tried to sanitize it, featured an entire cast of nocturnal horrors. There were shapeshifters who changed forms under moonlight. There were forest beings who whispered to lone travellers. There were creatures that perched on sleeping people's chests, stealing breath and leaving them unable to move. People didn't have a word for sleep paralysis. They had a word for demonic pressure. If someone woke terrified, unable to breathe, with the sensation of a heavy weight on their body, no one said, "Ah, that sounds like a neurological event." They said, "A demon sat on you," and everyone nodded in agreement because that explanation fit the world they lived in. Night was also considered the prime time for witchcraft. The church insisted that witches, if they existed, gathered after sunset to cast spells, summon spirits, and perform rituals. Even if actual witchcraft was rare, the fear of it wasn't. A sudden noise in the dark, especially near livestock, could spark suspicion. A person seen walking alone at night might as well have announced magical intentions. Even an owl screeching in the distance could be interpreted as a witch's familiar sending a message. Night mangled sounds and shapes, making illusions easy. A bent tree became a lurking figure. A loose shutter looked like a fayeur. A shadow across the field stretched in ways that convinced onlookers something unnatural was stalking the land. Medieval villagers lacked the luxury of electric light or scientific reassurance. What they saw in the dark wasn't questioned, it was believed. Even the natural landscape fed fear. Forests were enormous, dense, and poorly understood. Lakes and marshes produced eerie mists that crawled across the ground at night. Valleys echoed strangely. Hills hid shapes. You could stand outside at midnight and genuinely feel watched. Not because anything was there, but because everything seemed like it might be. And people didn't go outside to check. That was one of the few medieval rules everyone followed. Inside the home, the sense of vulnerability was just as strong. Darkness wasn't stopped by walls. These structures had gaps, drafts, and creaking beams that made the presence of the supernatural feel uncomfortably possible. A whispered sound by the door might be wind, or it might not. Homes didn't feel sealed, they felt permeable. A demon didn't need to break in, it just needed opportunity. Church doctrine reinforced this fear nightly. Demons weren't abstract enemies. They were described vividly: horned, clawed, shadowy, deceptive, persistent. If evil wanted to influence you, nighttime was the perfect time. You were tired, vulnerable, unable to see clearly, and far more likely to misinterpret anything unusual as supernatural intervention, which, to medieval people, wasn't a misinterpretation at all. Parents taught children that nighttime misbehaviour invited dark forces. This wasn't a bedtime story. It was a moral lesson delivered with absolute seriousness. A child who sneaked outside might return shaken, claiming they heard whispers or saw a shape moving along the tree line. Adults didn't respond with "you imagined it." They responded with "of course you did. What were you doing outside after dark?" Even adults were not immune. Tough farmers who faced wild animals without blinking wouldn't step into a moonless night without a lantern and a prayer. Travelling after dark was a last resort because you didn't just risk thieves or wolves, you risked walking directly into the supernatural spaces that only opened when the sun fled. And whether or not any of these creatures or forces were real didn't matter. Belief shaped perception, perception shaped fear, and fear shaped behaviour. In the medieval world, the supernatural wasn't a fantasy genre, it was a category of nightly risk. Demons didn't haunt the day, they waited, patiently, professionally. Because even evil, in the Middle Ages, respected office hours. In the Middle Ages, the night wasn't just a time for rest, it was the unofficial work shift of witches everywhere. At least that's what people believed. Darkness already held enough natural danger, but medieval imaginations added a full roster of magical threats that supposedly clocked in at sunset. If the day belonged to honest labour, the night belonged to suspicious activity, and nothing was more suspicious or more versatile than a witch. To medieval villagers, witches were not storybook hags stirring cauldrons in Halloween forests. They were neighbours, ordinary people, familiar faces, women who knew things, did things, or simply existed in ways others did not fully understand. And because fear thrives in uncertainty, nighttime gave people the perfect canvas to paint their anxieties onto whoever seemed different. Witchcraft, people believed, did not operate by daylight. The sun was too honest, the light too revealing. Spells, curses, potions, and secret meetings required the anonymity of night. If someone saw a figure walking quickly at dusk, or if a shadow moved strangely behind a barn, or if a lantern flickered where no one should be, whispers began. "She's out late. Strange, isn't it? Heard her muttering yesterday. Why is she always alone?" Medieval suspicion didn't need evidence, it needed timing. Most accusations started with nighttime misfortune. A cow fell suddenly ill. A baby cried uncontrollably. Bread refused to rise. Milk soured without warning. A horse threw a shoe. A candle guttered out at the wrong moment. Anything inconvenient, unexpected, or slightly irritating that happened after sunset could be pinned on magical interference. People tried to explain the unexplainable, and when explanations were scarce, witches filled the gap. Nighttime provided the perfect backdrop for these fears. Most homes limited their firelight after dark. Shadows shifted unpredictably. Sounds became mysterious. A fox screeching in the night might sound like a woman wailing. An owl hooting might sound like chanting. A breeze across a thatched roof could be mistaken for footsteps or fingers. When the natural world behaves strangely and the supernatural world is taken seriously, suspicion finds the easiest target. Witches were believed to gather at night for rituals, meetings, or pact-making with dark forces. No one could prove these meetings existed, but that didn't stop people from imagining them in perfect detail. The less people saw, the more detailed the stories became. In some communities, people believed witches transformed at night. into cats, crows, wolves, or other animals that move silently in the dark. These beliefs weren't whimsical, they were warnings. If a black cat crossed your path at dusk, you didn't think cute, you thought, is that Mrs. Elsbeth? And what is she plotting now? Because witches worked nights, even innocent nighttime behaviour became suspicious. Fetching water late, risky, checking on livestock after dark, suspicious, being seen outside past curfew, practically an admission of guilt. People learned quickly to stay indoors after the bell, not only to avoid thieves or supernatural danger, but to avoid becoming the danger in everyone else's eyes. And then there were the people who never went out at night. Ironically, also suspicious. Why does she never leave her house after sunset, villagers would whisper. What is she hiding? What is she doing indoors? In a world that saw witchcraft everywhere, you could be accused whether you were inside, outside, asleep or sneezing. Women suffered the most from this paranoia. Herbal knowledge, midwifery skills, or simply being unmarried could turn someone into the neighbourhood magical scapegoat. If she healed someone, she might be accused of using magic. If she failed to heal someone, she might be accused of using magic incorrectly. It was, in short, a no-win profession. Nighttime illnesses especially fueled witchcraft accusations. A child waking with a fever, a man groaning from a sudden pain, a cow collapsing overnight. All of these required explanations. Since darkness amplified fear, the explanations often landed on whichever woman was already making people uneasy. And once the community whispered a name, the rumours spread faster than the illness ever could. Superstitions existed to offer protection. People hung charms above their beds, placed iron tools near doors, or kept certain herbs by the window to prevent witches from entering. They avoided saying certain words after dark. They prayed more fervently before sleep. Every precaution, no matter how strange, had the same purpose: keep witchcraft out of the house. Witchcraft paranoia also influenced social behaviour. If someone disliked you, they might accuse you. If someone envied your livestock or your harvest, they might accuse you. If you survived an illness others didn't, they might accuse you. And if you were out at night for any reason, fetching water, tending the fire, helping a neighbour, your presence became evidence of something sinister. Medieval people didn't have forensic science, psychology or meteorology. They had fear, and fear explained things in the most dramatic way possible. When a door creaked at midnight, when a pot boiled strangely, when an animal cried out unnaturally, you weren't expected to investigate. You were expected to assume the worst. Because in the Middle Ages, nighttime wasn't just dark, it was magical in the worst possible way. And if something went wrong overnight, someone blamed a witch. Illness in the Middle Ages was frightening at the best of times, but nighttime transformed sickness into something far more sinister. A cough in daylight was an inconvenience. A cough at midnight felt like a countdown. The simple truth was this: people didn't trust the night with their health, and for good reason. When the sun went down, symptoms sharpened, fevers rose, strength drained, and the sick often slipped from unwell to dangerously ill within hours. Part of this fear came from observation. Medieval people didn't know about pathogens, dehydration, or circadian rhythms, but they knew what they saw. The sick almost always worsened after dark. A person who could stand in the afternoon might be delirious by nightfall. A child who seemed merely tired could wake moaning with fever. A wound that looked manageable in daylight could throb violently in the dark, swelling and reddening in ways that terrified anyone watching. Why did nighttime illness feel so brutal? Start with the environment. Medieval homes offered no clean, controlled conditions. Rooms were drafty, bedding was rough. Air chilled quickly. Warmth came from a single fire that needed constant tending, and if it died down, the cold invaded instantly. For someone battling infection, chills weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. A fever rising in the dark felt like the body waging war without reinforcements. Light made a difference too. By day, families could at least see what was happening to a sick loved one. They could check wounds, wipe sweat, measure pallor, or notice changes in breathing. At night, the flame of a candle or rushlight only illuminated patches of the face or body, creating a terrifying uncertainty. Was the patient's colour normal? Were they breathing steadily? Was that groan a good sign or a bad one? Firelight turned medical assessment into guesswork. Worse, the shadows cast by the flickering flame made the sick look even more haunted than they already were. A fever-flushed face became hollow and unfamiliar. Eyes appeared sunken. Movements seemed jerky. People looked less like themselves and more like versions of themselves pulled thin by sickness. Those attending them didn't just fear the illness. They feared what the illness made the person become in the dark. Night also stripped away distractions. During the day, family members bustled in and out. Chores demanded attention. Noise filled the air. And the sick person could drift in and out of awareness without feeling lonely. At night, everyone was quieter. The world slowed, and the sick were hyper-aware of their own bodies. Every ache, every shiver, every heartbeat suddenly magnified. Fear fed fever, fever fed fear, and the cycle deepened. And then there was the simple reality of medieval medicine. Nighttime offered no help. Physicians didn't make house calls at midnight. Apothecaries had long closed. Priests might come if you were dying, but they brought last rites, not treatment. Family members had no access to warm water. Fresh herbs or new bandages, everything they needed had to be prepared before sunset. If someone took a sudden turn after dark, you had exactly the resources available within arm's reach. If those weren't enough, you waited and prayed. Waiting, however, was agonizing. Nights stretched endlessly when someone was ill. A single hour felt like 3. The sick moaned or sweated or whispered incoherently. The caretaker fought exhaustion, trying to keep the fire alive, keep the patient warm, keep track of symptoms, and keep fear from swallowing them whole. Darkness made people feel powerless, and illness loves nothing more than an audience stripped of control. Even the way people breathe changed at night. Homes grew colder, air grew damp. Breathing became more strained. Congestion worsened. Medieval observers saw all of this and concluded, not unreasonably, that night itself was dangerous, that it encouraged illness, fed it, strengthened it. Daylight seemed to restrain it. Darkness gave it permission. Nighttime also raised moral and supernatural concerns. People believed that demons or evil spirits targeted the sick after sunset, attempting to claim those hovering between life and death. A delirious patient muttering in the dark was not seen as suffering from fever. They were seen as being tormented. If someone thrashed or gasped or cried out, their family feared that death itself had entered the room. Stories circulated of people who improved all day only to die at night. These accounts weren't rare, they were common, and the pattern reinforced the belief that darkness accelerated decline. The moment someone worsened at dusk, families braced themselves. They stoked the fire. They prayed. They stayed awake. They watched for signs the end was near, because more often than not, the night delivered the final blow. Even when people recovered, the night left a mark. I spoke of nights that seemed endless, where pain sharpened until dawn finally softened it. They described moments when breath caught in their chest or sweat poured off them, believing they were dying until morning light revealed that the worst had passed. In the medieval world, illness didn't wait for morning. It didn't rest. It didn't pause politely until the healer returned. Night didn't heal you. It sped things up. In the medieval world, midnight wasn't a literary flourish or a dramatic timestamp used by storytellers. It was a moment people genuinely feared, a line between one kind of danger and another. To us, midnight is symbolic. To them, midnight was literal. It was an hour so charged with meaning, superstition, and expectation that it practically carried its own personality. And that personality was stern, watchful, and absolutely not friendly. Midnight marked the point when night felt deepest, when darkness had settled so fully that even the memory of daylight seemed unlikely. The world grew quiet in a different way, not the gentle stillness modern cities rarely experience, but a thick, waiting quiet. If dusk was a warning and late evening was an unease, midnight was the moment when the night felt complete. People believed the hour itself had power. Midnight wasn't just late, it was a threshold, a spiritual turning point where forces invisible in daylight reached their peak. Medieval understanding of time was deeply tied to religion and folklore, and midnight held a reputation built from both. It was the devil's hour long before early modern Europe coined the term. It was the moment when demons were most active, witches most powerful, and the dead most restless. Even the church, which often tried to regulate superstition, acknowledged midnight's heaviness by assigning prayers to combat the temptations believed strongest then. For ordinary people, midnight was when the world felt least stable. If a sound broke the silence at midnight, a knock, a cry, a footstep, the reaction was immediate and visceral. "What is that?" was never asked calmly. Those awake at midnight weren't easing into the next day, they were watching the night perform whatever unpredictable thing it intended. The timing mattered in practical ways too. Bodies behaved differently at midnight. Those who were ill often declined at that hour, not because midnight held medical significance, but because exhaustion, cold and fever convergence made symptoms peak then. Families knew this. They saw it often enough to associate midnight with danger. A sick person who made it past midnight without worsening was considered lucky. One who faltered at that hour was assumed to be close to the end. Midnight became the unofficial health checkpoint no one wanted to reach. Midnight was also when the night watch struggled most. Earlier in the evening, they might still have some alertness remaining, some contact with people finishing late chores or returning from the tavern. But at midnight, the streets were empty. The exhaustion of the day settled in. The cold cut deeper. Shadows felt heavier. And because even the watch rarely vocalized their fear, the entire village took on a tense, hushed vigilance. Travellers feared midnight in particular. Travelling at night was dangerous regardless, but being on the road at midnight felt like tempting fate deliberately. You couldn't judge distances. Landmarks disappeared. Animals grew bold. And you were navigating a world where every ridge, every tree, every corner might conceal something you preferred not to meet. People timed their journeys carefully because arriving at a village gate at midnight was almost pointless. Gates were closed, guards were sleepy and suspicious, and inns were barred for the night. Midnight wasn't a time for arrivals, it was a time for regrets. Inside homes, midnight shaped behaviour too. People often woke naturally, due to the two-part sleep cycle common in medieval life, but waking at midnight felt different than waking earlier. It wasn't the same as waking in the late evening or rising near dawn. Midnight was uncanny. Families whispered rather than talked. The fire was low, the air sharp. If someone got up to check on livestock or stir the embers, the entire household felt the shift. Even children sensed the weight of the hour, and spoke of it with the hushed awe usually reserved for sacred places. Prayer was common at midnight. Not the hopeful morning prayers or the grateful evening ones. Midnight prayers had a different tone. They were protective, defensive. Words people murmured under their breath to hold the darkness at bay. Some prayed out loud, believing their voices pushed back against whatever prowled unseen. Others prayed silently, too afraid to break the stillness with sound. And then there were the stories. Midnight fed storytelling like nothing else. Tales of spirits that appeared only at the stroke of 12. Legends of travellers who vanished precisely at that hour. Accounts of animals behaving strangely. Of light seen in the forest. Of voices with no source. Midnight didn't create these stories, but it curated them. Anything frightening that lacked explanation could be traced back to midnight simply because it fit the mood so perfectly. The rhythm of the night reinforced these beliefs. Midnight was the pivot. Before it lay the remnants of human activity, after it lay the growing promise of dawn. It sat between worlds, and medieval people felt that acutely. Midnight had rituals, responses, and fears built into it, not because they misunderstood time, but because they understood their world all too well. When midnight arrived, it didn't slip in quietly. It announced itself in the minds of those who listened. A shift in the wind, a deeper darkness, a silence so complete it practically echoed. Midnight wasn't poetic, it was punctual. In the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't guaranteed, and waking up was worse, not the gentle, what time is it, kind of waking. No. Medieval nighttime wake-ups were loud, abrupt, and instantly terrifying because the simple rule was, if something woke you, something had gone wrong. There were no pleasant surprises at 2 a.m, and no surprise cake, no early morning mail, only crises. Most medieval households slept deeply because exhaustion was the standard setting. But even the heaviest sleeper would jerk awake to certain sounds. A crack, a scream, a thud, a howl, a shouted name, the unmistakable roar of fire, or the panicked banging of someone at the door. Nighttime disruptions were emergencies, plain and simple. The night wasn't generous enough to interrupt sleep for anything else. The first and most feared interruption came from fire. Fire was the great traitor of the medieval night, useful by day, murderous by darkness. Every home relied on an open hearth, and open hearths loved to misbehave. A spark leaping from the embers could ignite straw bedding, wooden floors, thatched roofs, or the clothing drying too close. A sudden pop from the fireplace could mean a log had shifted dangerously. A faint crackling from above might indicate the thatch catching. If you woke to shouting or heat, you had seconds, maybe minutes, before your home became a lantern no one had asked for. Families didn't just fear fire because it destroyed possessions. They feared how uncontrollable it was at night. Darkness made flames harder to trace. Smoke pooled near low ceilings. Embers hid under debris. And if your home caught fire, so could the neighbours, and the next, and the next. A nighttime fire was not a personal disaster. It was a community nightmare. Being woken by someone yelling fire meant instant chaos, grabbing water, hauling children out of bed, shouting warnings to others. Hearts raced long before feet hit the floor. But fire wasn't the only reason sleep shattered. Screams were another. In the quiet darkness, a scream carried far. Shrill, sudden, unmistakable. A scream might mean someone had been attacked, or injured, or startled awake by something they saw or felt. Screams didn't come with explanations. They came with adrenaline and panic. A scream in the night made people freeze before they moved, because they knew two things. It was bad, and they were about to find out how bad. A scream from inside the house was its own terror. Maybe a child woke from a fever dream. Maybe someone was sick and crying out in pain. Maybe someone stumbled in the dark and fell. Parents leapt from bed before their minds even processed what they'd heard. When your roof was thin, when your fire was unpredictable, when illness lurked everywhere, and when supernatural fears hovered at the edge of your imagination, a scream was not something you ever ignored. Alarms, bells, horns, shouts, pounding created a different kind of panic. Medieval towns used sound as their first and only warning system. If a watchman struck the alarm bell at night, every household sat upright instantly. It could mean a house was burning, a thief had been spotted, a prisoner had escaped, wolves had entered the outskirts, an enemy or raiding party approached, someone had gone missing. Something unexplained was happening, which was always the worst category. Alarm bells weren't polite notifications. They were desperate commands. Wake up. Something is wrong, handle it. And people obeyed, because hesitation wasn't an option. Sometimes the alarm wasn't a bell, it was pounding on the door. A neighbour might need help, a midwife might be summoned for a woman in labour. A farmer might alert others that his animals had escaped. A family member might come shouting news of an injury. Whatever the reason. If someone knocked violently at night, they weren't making a social call. They were delivering trouble. And then there were the subtler but equally alarming wake-ups, a noise that didn't belong. A heavy thump near the door, footsteps on the threshold, the latch rattling, the dog growling, an animal crashing into a fence, a whisper of movement outside the wall. These sounds didn't require explanation, they required action. Someone had to check the door, someone had to look outside, someone had to grab a stick or a tool or whatever passed for protection. Nobody wanted to be the one doing it, but someone always had to. For people already on edge, parents with sick children, farmers guarding livestock, villagers who feared thieves or spirits, these noises turned sleep into a fragile, breakable thing. One unfamiliar sound at the wrong moment sent the entire household into vigilance mode. And it's important to remember, medieval people didn't wake slowly. They woke violently. There were no soft alarm clocks, no gentle lights, no sense of time. You woke disoriented, heart pounding, unsure whether you'd slept an hour or half a night. Your first thought was rarely what is happening, it was what's wrong. Because in the medieval world, nighttime brought no positive interruptions. If someone woke you, it meant danger. If something woke you, it meant threat. If nothing woke you, but you woke anyway, you assumed something bad was about to reveal itself. Night was not generous with rest. It was impatient, volatile, and deeply inconsiderate. Nobody woke up at night for good news. If there was one universally agreed upon medieval rule, besides don't insult the Lord, it was this. Do not travel after dark. Roads belong to sunlight. Paths belong to daylight. After sunset, the world outside your home stopped being geography and became risk. Travelling at night wasn't adventurous. It wasn't bold. It wasn't noble. It was a gamble where the stakes were your possessions, your safety, and occasionally your life, and the odds were stacked against you from the moment you stepped outside. The first and most obvious problem was visibility, or rather, the complete absence of it. Medieval roads weren't roads the way we imagine them. They were dirt tracks, uneven footpaths, wagon ruts, or trails marked by familiar trees and stones that made sense only when you could actually see them. At night, everything disappeared. Landmarks dissolved into the darkness. Paths blended with fields. Forest edges became black walls. Distances collapsed. Travellers didn't just risk missing a turn. They risked wandering into a river, bog, ditch, or someone's livestock pen. And no, torches didn't help much. They illuminated a very small bubble of light surrounded by absolute black. You could see your own hand clearly and absolutely nothing else. Worse, torches announced your presence like a beacon shouting, "Hello, I am here, and I may or may not have valuables." Carrying light made you visible long before you could see who or what might be watching you. Speaking of watchers, robbers loved the night. A lone traveller stumbling through darkness was their ideal customer. You were disoriented, hesitant, partially blinded, and probably unsure whether the shape ahead of you was a person or a tree. They, on the other hand, knew the terrain, the hiding spots, and how to move silently. A robber didn't need to chase you, he just had to wait for you to accidentally walk straight into him. Robbers hid behind hedges, crouched in roadside ditches, or simply approached from behind when your torch flickered low. Night travel turned ambush from a possibility into a near certainty. And if a group of criminals roamed together, you had no chance. You couldn't count them. You couldn't see their weapons. You couldn't tell whether you were surrounded until hands were already grabbing your belongings. But robbers weren't the only threat. Roadside inns closed their gates at night, meaning a traveller caught after dusk had nowhere to seek shelter. The innkeeper wasn't opening the door for a stranger who appeared out of the dark. They valued their safety more than your lodging fee. Even walled towns shut their gates for the night. You could arrive at midnight, exhausted, freezing, desperate for safety, and the guards would still shout back, "Come back at dawn," because they weren't risking opening their gates in darkness for someone who could be harmless or could be leading trouble right inside. If you couldn't find shelter, you had to keep walking or sit miserably by the roadside, hoping the night didn't pick you as its entertainment. This was especially dangerous near forests, which medieval Europe had plenty of. Forests at night were maze-like, unnervingly loud, and populated with animals that were far more comfortable moving in the dark than you were. Wolves, boars, and other creatures didn't attack every night, but they existed, and that was enough to keep travellers trembling. Boars in particular were a nightmare scenario, nearly blind, easily startled, and aggressively explosive when they felt threatened. A traveller stumbling near one in the dark wouldn't have time to wonder what hit them. And even if no living threat appeared, the terrain itself was hostile. Roads were uneven, roots jutted upward, rocks hid under grass. Holes appeared where carts had passed too many times. One misstep could twist an ankle or break a bone. If you fell, there was no one to find you until morning. People went missing this way, not from violence, but from the silent, merciless geometry of the medieval landscape. And then there was disorientation, the mental war the night waged on anyone foolish enough to travel through it. When the world disappears into shadow, your sense of direction collapses. You lose track of how far you've gone. You confuse one path for another. You mistake the silhouette of a hill for a looming structure. You follow what you think is the road, only to realize it's a dried stream bed leading nowhere. There were no road signs, no lights, no helpful markers painted onto trees. Roads forked with no warning, merged without reason, and twisted unpredictably. A traveller could swear he knew the way home and still wander for hours in circles. Worse yet, the night had a way of making you hear things, far-off sounds that felt close sounds that seemed to echo from everywhere, the faint whisper of the wind that sounded like a voice. Fear worked with darkness to scramble your sense of reality. Was that a human footstep behind you, or your own? Was someone calling your name, or was it just the wind squeezing through the trees? Travellers often panicked themselves into wrong turns simply because their mind decided danger was approaching, and every time they stopped to get their bearings, the dark closed in tighter. Medieval advice manuals didn't sugarcoat things. They warned explicitly, do not travel at night, not because it was difficult, not because it was unpleasant, but because the night turned the world into a puzzle, one you couldn't solve and one that punished every wrong guess. During the day, roads were paths. At night, roads were rumours. Directions worked beautifully at noon. After sunset, directions stopped working when the sun did. In the Middle Ages, being awake at night didn't make people think, oh, poor thing, they can't sleep. It made them think, what is wrong with you and what exactly are you planning? Nighttime wasn't just a period of darkness, it was a moral landscape. And anyone awake when honest Christians were supposed to be sleeping stood out like a torch in a cellar. Daylight was for labour, night was for rest. Anything deviating from that rhythm felt unnatural and vaguely dangerous. Medieval society prized predictability. People rose together with sunrise, worked alongside each other under the daylight, and retreated indoors once the evening bell rang. A person who didn't follow this pattern, who stayed up late, wandered outside after hours, or even tossed restlessly in bed, upset the social and spiritual logic that governed the community. Because if you weren't resting, the assumption wasn't that you were insomniac, it was that you were up to something. And in a world where something included theft, witchcraft, sin, secret meetings, or dealings with suspicious individuals, this was not a flattering assumption. Insomnia itself was suspect. A person unable to sleep might claim anxiety, illness, or grief, but those explanations were flimsy in the medieval moral imagination. Why couldn't they relax like everyone else? Why wasn't their conscience at ease? Why did their mind wander after dark instead of settling into sleep like a well-behaved soul? People genuinely believed that a restful sleeper was a moral sleeper. Someone who lay awake was either hiding guilt or attracting the wrong kind of attention from supernatural forces. A restless night might signify the devil's presence or the stirring of sinful impulses. A guilty mind, they said, kept late hours. Even just being seen awake in your own home at odd hours aroused talk. A candle burning late meant someone inside had business, and business was rarely interpreted generously. Rumours spread quickly. She was up when I passed the house. He lit a lantern after curfew. I heard voices long after dark. None of these statements ended with a charitable interpretation. Wandering outside at night was even worse. The moment you stepped beyond your door, you were a walking red flag. Medieval people didn't take casual evening strolls. They didn't clear their heads under the moon or get fresh air to help them sleep. If you were outside, you were either ignoring the curfew, making secret plans, or conducting yourself in ways that invited suspicion or scandal. A person walking at night might be labelled a thief scouting houses, a lover meeting someone in secret, a servant delivering illicit messages, a witch on the prowl, a sinner avoiding witnesses, a spy or outsider. or someone possessed, confused, or spiritually compromised. There was no good category. Even legitimate reasons for being awake looked incriminating. Checking on livestock was normal during the day. Doing so at midnight looked suspicious. Fetching water early was understandable. Fetching it in the dark suggested you didn't want to be seen. Tending a sick child before dawn was tragic, but neighbours might still whisper, "Why is she moving around so much? What else is she hiding?" The watchmen, though exhausted and reluctant heroes of the night, were trained to stop anyone awake after hours. Being questioned by the watch was humiliating, especially if you had no convincing explanation. "I couldn't sleep" was not an explanation, at least not one the medieval mind found believable. People expected moral reasons for behaviour, not physiological ones. Even noises inside a home could spark rumours. If a neighbour heard footsteps, whispered conversations, or the creaking of a floorboard, they didn't dismiss it as insomnia. They wondered who was awake and why. Night amplified imagination. A person pacing the floor might simply be anxious, but to a nearby listener, it might sound like plotting. Gossip fed on this. If someone already had a reputation as odd, unlucky, aloof, or simply different, nighttime behaviour became ammunition. "He's always awake," they might say. "Never sleeps. No wonder strange things happen around him." A woman known for herbal knowledge or independence might find herself accused of meeting spirits or performing magic under the cover of night. The church reinforced the idea that nighttime wakefulness was spiritually risky. Priests warned that darkness tempted the mind towards sinful thoughts. Staying awake voluntarily was practically inviting temptation through the front door. A person who valued their soul should, in theory, be asleep. If they weren't, the church wanted to know why. On the rare occasions when someone needed to be awake, midwives attending labour, caretakers tending the sick, shepherds protecting flocks, they often explained themselves openly and loudly just to avoid suspicion. "I'm awake for the childbirth," someone might shout to the passing watchman. "Just going to check a fever," another might call from the doorway. Night demanded constant justification. Being awake when others slept wasn't neutral. It was morally charged. People believed a good Christian didn't roam, wander, or stir at odd hours unless duty forced them into it. Anything else was a crack in one's character. Sleeplessness wasn't tiredness. It was questionable character. Children in the Middle Ages didn't simply discover that nighttime was terrifying, they were trained to understand it. Fear of the dark wasn't an instinctive childhood phase to grow out of. It was a cultural lesson, repeated so consistently and so thoroughly that by the time a child reached adulthood, nighttime fear felt natural, like breathing, eating, or avoiding the neighbour rumoured to know too much about herbs. From the moment they could understand words, medieval children were taught that the dark was not their friend. Parents, grandparents, older siblings, priests, neighbours, and even wandering storytellers reinforced the message. Daylight was safe, night was not. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival training. In a world without electricity, street lamps, secure houses, or police, fear was a practical tool. Adults passed it down the way they passed down farming skills or cooking techniques. Children learned fear the same way they learned language, by constant exposure. The warnings began early. Bedtime wasn't framed as peaceful rest, but as necessary avoidance. Don't go outside. Stay close to the fire. Keep the blanket over your feet. Don't talk to shadows. Parents weren't trying to frighten their children for entertainment. They genuinely believed that the dark was full of danger. Telling kids to be cautious wasn't enough. Children aren't cautious by default. Telling them the dark will swallow you whole was far more effective. Stories reinforced this education. Medieval childhood was rich with cautionary tales that would make modern parents faint. There were stories about children who wandered into forests and were never seen again. Stories about spirits that stole children who didn't sleep on time. Stories about demons that grabbed those who played too close to the door after sunset. Stories about wolves that lurked just beyond the threshold. waiting for a little footstep. Almost every bedtime tale had a moral, and that moral was usually obey, stay inside and don't test the night unless you want to disappear. Adults didn't sugarcoat things. If a child asked what's outside, they heard answers like things that love the dark, or creatures that hunt, or spirits that don't like children talking. A modern parent might offer a nightlight. A medieval parent offered religious reminders, stern warnings, or quick prayers. Fear was not only normal, it was expected. And children paid attention. They learned from the way adults behaved at dusk. The moment the sun dropped, the entire village changed. Doors closed, windows were shut, curtains or shutters were pulled tight, fires were tended, tools were put away, voices grew quiet. There was a collective hurry in the air, as if the whole community knew something dangerous was about to clock in for the night shift. Children felt this urgency long before they understood it. They also absorbed the anxiety adults tried to hide. The way their father paused at a strange noise, the way their mother checked the door latch twice, the way a neighbour muttered a prayer before walking home in the last light, the way the watchman's torch shook slightly in his tired hands. Fear was contagious, and children caught it easily. Parents reinforced nighttime fear because children were famously unpredictable. A bored child might wander outside, a curious child might open the door, a restless child might slip away to chase a noise or see the moon. Adults knew that even one adventurous child could become a tragedy. So they used fear to create boundaries. Better a child terrified of the dark than a child lost to it. Even within the home, nighttime rules were strict. Children were told not to look out the window after sunset, not to approach the door, not to answer if someone knocked late, not to stir alone. They were instructed to sleep close to adults or siblings, not for comfort, though that was a bonus, but for safety. An isolated child was a vulnerable child. Religious instruction magnified this training. Priests warned children that evil forces were more active at night. Sermons taught them that sin thrived in darkness. Lessons at church or around the hearth painted the night as a time when God tested souls and when temptations prowled. A child might not understand the theology, but they understood the fear. Children also learned fear through experience. A cow bawling in the night, a dog barking frantically, a sudden gust slamming a shutter open, a candle going out without warning, a sibling waking with a nightmare, a feverish cry from a neighbour's house. Every unexplained nighttime event felt like a confirmation of the lessons they'd been taught. You were not supposed to be awake right now, and whatever was moving out there was not meant for you. And of course, children imitated adults. If an adult gasped at a sound, the child learned the sound was dangerous. If an adult whispered at night, the child learned that silence was survival. If an adult hurried inside, the child learned to do the same. Fear wasn't instructed once, it was demonstrated nightly. By adolescence, nighttime fear felt normal. By adulthood, it was the instinct. Grown men who could wrestle livestock and fight thieves still hurried home at sunset. Women who managed households with iron resolve still checked the door twice before bed. Fear wasn't childish, it was cultural wisdom. You weren't born afraid of the dark. You were educated. In the Middle Ages, people didn't just fear death, they scheduled it. Or rather, they believed death scheduled itself, and its preferred visiting hours were unmistakably after dark. If someone was gravely ill, everyone in the household watched the sun with dread, because once the world slipped into darkness, the likelihood of death seemed to sharpen. It wasn't just superstition, it was a pattern people witnessed so often that nighttime became synonymous with final breaths. It began with observation. Medieval families saw over and over that loved ones who struggled through the day often weakened dramatically at night. A person who whispered feebly at sunset might be unresponsive by moonrise. A child with fever who could still lift a hand at dusk might drift beyond reach by midnight. A wounded man who fought bravely in the afternoon might fail suddenly in the stillness after dark. Medieval people didn't need medical textbooks. They had experience, and experience repeatedly told them night was when life slipped away. Without understanding infection, dehydration, shock, fever cycles, or organ failure, they concluded something far simpler. The night itself was lethal. Darkness didn't just hide danger, it amplified the body's fragility. When the world grew cold, silent, and uncontrollable, it felt as though death moved more freely, inspecting each weakened body with deliberate patience. Families kept vigil because they believed death arrived actively. Staying awake was a form of resistance. People prayed beside beds, whispered comforting words, touched hands gone too cold, and watched, helplessly or as breath rose and fell unevenly. A sigh that seemed too long made everyone lean forward. A sudden stillness made hearts freeze. The room's tension felt like it had weight. Every minute edged toward a dreaded possibility. And then, when midnight arrived, fear spiked. Midnight wasn't just a time, it was a threshold. A turning of the world when the living were thought to be closest to the realm of spirits. If you were sick, the hours between midnight and dawn were the danger zone. If you survived them, the entire family breathed easier. If you didn't, well, nobody was surprised. Priests reinforced this fear. They described nighttime as a period when souls were more vulnerable to spiritual forces, both holy and unholy. Dying in daylight seemed peaceful, almost gentle. Dying at night seemed more ominous, as though darkness had authority over your last moments. Clergy didn't mean to frighten people, but sermons about demon-seeking souls or angels retrieving the righteous carried more weight when the listener was already hearing strange noises in the dark. And then there was the practical terror. Nighttime deaths were harder to respond to. If someone died during daylight, people could fetch a priest and summon family, prepare the body, or notify neighbours. If someone died at night, they had to wait in the dark with the body until morning. No one wanted to open the door, no one wanted to walk to town, no one wanted to leave the household vulnerable by scattering its members. So they stayed in the room, sometimes sobbing, sometimes praying, sometimes simply watching the stillness in disbelief. The stillness made everything worse. In daylight, the world was active. You heard voices, tools, chickens, footsteps, carts. At night, silence priest inward. A death occurred inside a vacuum of sound, magnifying grief. There was no distraction, no bustle, no comfort from the movement of others, just darkness, quiet, and the knowledge that someone had slipped beyond reach while the world lay motionless outside. Nighttime also created confusion. Was the person truly gone, or were they barely breathing? Families leaned close to feel air from the nose, placed hands over chests to sense movement, held candles beside mouths to see if the flame wavered. Firelight distorted features. Shadows made the dead look alive, or the living look dead. You could mistake shallow breathing for none at all, or vice versa. The uncertainty made the waiting unbearable. Children often woke during nighttime deaths, sensing the tension or hearing muffled sobs. They were ushered to corners or wrapped in blankets while adults tried to manage grief quietly. A child who saw a loved one die at night didn't forget it. Stories spread. "Death comes in the dark," they whispered. Adults didn't correct them because they believed it too. Villagers also noticed livestock dying more often overnight. Animals collapsed unexpectedly, especially during harsh weather. This fed the belief that night was a time when death walked freely, selecting victim as it pleased. People whispered that spirits wandered then, or that angels passed through homes seeking souls, or that death itself travelled invisibly along the roads at night. Folklore amplified this. Tales described death arriving as a silent figure at midnight, tapping on shutters or passing through walls. People spoke of hearing a knocking that foretold someone's passing, or seeing a pale light hovering near the home of a dying person. Whether these were imagination, coincidence, or pure storytelling didn't matter. The message was the same. Night invited death. Even the natural world seemed to support the belief. Night was coldest when bodies were weakest. Night was quietest when breathing faltered. Night was longest when pain intensified. People couldn't see improvement. They could only feel deterioration. And so death earned its reputation. When someone was sick at dusk, families hoped. When they were sick at evening, families prayed. When they were sick at midnight, families prepared themselves. Because in the Middle Ages, death didn't surprise anyone after dark. Midnight had a reputation, and it earned it. The Middle Ages were full of real dangers. Wolves, sickness, superstition, poor lighting, fragile houses, but none of them fully explained why nighttime felt so much worse than day. The real terror wasn't just in what lurked outside, and it was in what happened inside the mind when darkness settled. Night stripped away the noise, the movement, the social reassurance, and the comforting distractions of daylight, leaving people alone with their thoughts. And medieval thoughts, shaped by their religion, folklore, and daily hardship, were not gentle companions. To understand why the night felt more frightening, start with isolation. In daylight, the world was communal. People worked together, talked together, argued together, traded, prayed, gossiped, and moved as a unit. You rarely faced anything alone, whether that was a plough that wouldn't behave or a neighbour who owed you grain. Even danger felt manageable when 20 people were standing around judging it. But at night, the community vanished. Doors closed, families retreated. The village became a collection of silent houses, each lit by a single wavering flame. You didn't see your neighbours. You didn't hear their voices. You didn't know what they were doing. You belonged to the night in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable. You could call for help, but would anyone hear you? Would they come? Or would they stand frozen behind their shutters, listening, afraid of what answering might expose them to? That isolation made even the smallest noise feel personal. A creak wasn't a creak, it was a creak near you. A rustle wasn't outside somewhere, it was outside your home. In the day, the world was full of movement. At night, every movement seemed intended. Then came vulnerability. Humans are daylight creatures, visually oriented, dependent on sight for navigation and safety. Darkness removes that advantage. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't symbolic. It was literal. You couldn't see what was coming, you couldn't prepare, you couldn't defend effectively. You were reduced to sound, instinct, and imagination, all of which are notoriously unreliable under stress. If something approached your home in daylight, you saw it, you assessed it, you reacted rationally. If something approached your home at night, you had no idea what it was. It might have been a neighbour's cow, it might have been a thief, it might have been a demon, depending on what chapter of the Bible your priest had emphasised that week. And because you couldn't identify the source, your brain filled in the gaps, and it rarely filled them with anything comforting. This is where imagination became the strongest force in medieval psychology. When the mind lacks clear information, it creates its own explanations. And in a world shaped by folklore, religion, and communal storytelling, those explanations tended to be worst-case scenarios. Not because medieval people were melodramatic, but because their worldview treated danger as the default condition of life. Every story, every sermon, every tale told by the hearth reinforced the idea that the world was full of invisible threats, and the dark was their natural habitat. If an object looked odd in the corner, you didn't assume it was a cloak. You assumed it was something not human. If a sound echoed from the wall, you didn't assume it was settling wood. You assumed it was a presence. If you felt watched, you didn't dismiss it. You acknowledged the possibility. Night encouraged these interpretations because night removed everything that usually disproved them, and medieval life offered few psychological tools to cope with uncertainty. No one said, "It's probably nothing." People said, "Stay close, pray, don't move." Anxiety wasn't calmed, it was validated. So the imagination learned to flourish in the hours when logic went to sleep. Silence made things worse. Real silence, no hum of appliances, no distant traffic, no mechanical noise, makes the mind louder. In medieval villages, silence wasn't peaceful, it was It felt like the world was holding its breath. Children sensed it, adults lived with it. Silence felt like the darkness had ears. Then there was the fear born from lack of explanation. During the day, If something happened, a broken tool, a stolen chicken, a sudden illness, people worked together to solve it. Daylight was practical, it demanded action. Night didn't demand anything except endurance. If something occurred at night, you were stuck waiting until dawn to interpret it. Imagine hearing a sound at night and having to wait 8 hours to discover its cause. That waiting carved fear into the mind. And the worst part, many nighttime fears didn't resolve in the morning. If you thought you heard footsteps, you never truly knew whether someone had been outside. If you believed you saw something move, the sun didn't prove you wrong, it simply erased the evidence. The mind doesn't forget those uncertainties. They compound, layering fear on fear until nighttime becomes a psychological minefield. Day was factual, night was interpretive. Day offered explanations, night let them explain themselves. And when a medieval imagination explained things, it rarely chose the comforting version. In the end, night felt worse than day, not because the world was more dangerous after sunset, though it certainly was, but because people had fewer tools to confront that danger, both physically and mentally. The darkness didn't just hide threats. It magnified them, invited them, let them wander freely through the mind. The day lit the world, the night lit the fears. By the time the sun rose in the Middle Ages, people didn't simply wake up, they celebrated. Dawn wasn't just another hour of the day, it was proof of survival, proof that nothing clawed at the shutters. Nothing set the roof on fire, nothing dragged off the livestock, nothing whispered through cracks in the walls, and nothing in the night singled you out. The morning light wasn't symbolic. It was a signal that the world had reset, that danger had retreated for a few predictable hours. And medieval people cherished daylight the way modern people cherish Wi-Fi. Life simply worked better with it. Looking back across all the fears, dangers, and uncertainties that filled the medieval night, something becomes clear. Their fear made sense. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't childish. It wasn't superstition alone. Night wasn't merely dark, it was hostile. The human body, the environment, the community, and the imagination all worked against you after sunset. Start with the practical threats. Homes weren't secure, fires misbehaved. Roads became invisible. Watchmen fell asleep standing up. Crime flourished. The dark turned the familiar world into something unpredictable, and unpredictability is the root of fear. A medieval villager didn't fear the night because they were overly dramatic. They feared it because nighttime was, statistically speaking, when things went wrong. Then add the physical realities. Illness worsened after sunset. Fevers rose. Breathing became harder. Wounds throbbed. Comfort was scarce. Medical help was non-existent. A person who survived the night while sick had already overcome one of the harshest obstacles of medieval life, their own body's tendency to collapse during the coldest, quietest hours. Social structures collapsed at night too. The moment the curfew bell rang, the community dissolved. You were on your own. Neighbours locked their doors. Watchmen muttered prayers. Even the bravest people avoided stepping outside. Humans are not meant to take on the world alone, but nighttime forced them to. And then there was the psychological truth, arguably the most powerful. Medieval days were structured, guided by the collective routines. Night stripped that away, routine dissolved, safety dissolved, certainty dissolved. You weren't surrounded by workers or family or village life. You were surrounded by your own thoughts in a creaking, breathing, whispering house that offered exactly as much security as its thin walls allowed. Fear wasn't something medieval people invented. Fear was something medieval people inherited. From dangerous landscapes, from real predators, from disease cycles, from poor lighting and poorer housing, from their communities' stories, from their religion, from their lived experience. Everything reinforced the same message. Your odds are better in daylight. And the people who listened to that message were the ones who stayed alive long enough to pass those instincts to the next generation. It's also important to recognize that fear served a purpose. Medieval fear wasn't paralyzing, it was functional. It kept families indoors, it kept fires tended, it kept children safe, it kept travelers from getting lost. Fear was an early warning system, a protective instinct that filled in the gaps left by a world where information was scarce, dangers were frequent, and survival was a daily calculation. Fearing the night wasn't a flaw, it was strategy. After all, if the night is full of thieves, wolves, demons, sickness, unstable fires, rattling shutters, and noises the human mind is definitely not equipped to interpret, shouldn't you be at least a little terrified? The medieval mind didn't overreact. It reacted exactly the way the environment demanded. And yet the beauty of medieval life was this: every night eventually ended. No matter how long the shadow stretched, no matter how many creaks echoed through the walls, no matter how many times you checked the door latch, dawn always arrived. That first trace of blue on the horizon was more than morning. It was reassurance. The world was visible again. The roads made sense again. The mind quieted again. Life resumed. People cherished the sunrise not because it was lovely, but because it restored order. The night unravelled things, the day wove them back together. And so each morning came with a kind of triumphant relief. A medieval person could open the shutters, stretch stiff limbs, step outside and say, "Well, nothing got me this time." They didn't fear the night because they were weak. They feared it because they were smart enough to understand their world. The good news? You survived the night. The bad news? You have to do it again tomorrow.